11 months later, Julian Ash would be on his knees on a wet loading dock in South Boston, crying into a phone that no longer dialed out. And the woman he'd called a waste of a chair would be the one deciding whether he ever stood up again. She wasn't the kind of woman that room was built for. She was size 22 in a sea of size 2, invisible by design, quiet by necessity, and everyone in that ballroom had spent 4 years agreeing she didn't matter. Then the man at table 1 set down his glass. He didn't shout. He didn't stand fast. He simply rose, 6.5 feet of stillness in a black suit, and asked, in a voice like a door locking, "Say it again. Slower. I want to hear which words you chose." Rain had been falling on Boston for 9 straight days, the kind that didn't fall so much as lean, and Marisol Vance had walked to work through all 9 of them because the tea cost $2.90 each way and her mother's care facility cost $11,000 a month. She arrived at Wexford Holdings at 6:40 every morning. She left at 8:15 every night. In between, she did the work of 4 people and was thanked by none of them. And the thing she had learned in 4 years of this was that invisibility was a kind of armor if you wore it correctly. Nobody watched what they said in front of Mari. Nobody wondered what she noticed. She was furniture with a pulse, the heavy woman at the desk outside the executive floor who kept the calendar straight and the coffee hot and her mouth shut. That was the mistake, because Mari noticed everything. She noticed which board members took meetings that never appeared on any agenda. She noticed that the Harbor Line shipping invoices came in on Thursdays and were paid on Thursdays. Same day, no review, an impossibility in a company that made her file 3 forms to order pens. She noticed that Gareth Wexford, CEO, a man with a jaw like a monument to himself, went pale exactly once a quarter, and always after a call from a number with no name. And she noticed, because she could not stop noticing, that the office where her father had worked for 19 years was now a wellness room with a beanbag chair in it. Thomas Vance had been Wexford's chief accountant. He had been careful and tired and gentle, and he had ironed his own shirts. 6 years ago, the company found $4 million missing and his name on every transfer, and the press called him a thief for 11 days. And on the 12th day, he sat down in his car in the garage under the building and never got out. Mari was the one who found the note. It said 4 words. "I didn't take it." Her mother read it, and something in her cracked, and the cracking never stopped. It just moved inward, year after year, until the woman who had taught Mari to read no longer knew her name. So Mari took a job at the company that killed her father. She took the job because grief is not a reason and revenge is not a plan, but proximity is a start. She had no money, no lawyer, no leverage, no allies. She had a chair outside the executive floor and a memory that didn't let go. She had been waiting 4 years for a door to open. She didn't know it would open on a man. The name Belandi wasn't spoken at Wexford Holdings. It was referred to. It came up sideways in half sentences, in the way people say the word cancer when a sick man is still in the room. Cassian Belandi ran the Harbor Line, the freight lines, the union locals, the cold storage warehouses, the 12 miles of waterfront where nothing moved without his permission, and occasionally something stopped moving forever. He had inherited it at 24, after his father was shot 4 times in a restaurant in the North End, and in the 11 years since he had turned a violent, sloppy, screaming organization into something worse, a quiet one. Mari had heard the stories the way everyone in Boston had, that he'd taken the whole Kelleher operation in a single night without a shot fired, because by the time anyone thought to fight, all 4 of their money men had already chosen him, that he'd once let a man talk for 20 minutes and then said only, "Thank you for your honesty." And that man was never seen again. And the terrible part, the part that stayed with her, was that people said he'd meant it, that he really had appreciated the honesty, that it had changed nothing. He came to the building 4 times a year. She'd never seen him. She only knew he'd been there because on those days the executive floor was silent in a way that had texture, a held-breath silence, a silence with weight, and because Gareth Wexford's hand shook when he signed things afterward. She used to think that silence was fear of a monster. It took her a long time to understand it was fear of an accountant. The investor reception was the third Thursday in November. 200 people in the atrium, catering that cost more than her mother's monthly meds, and Julian Ash working the room like a man being filmed by a camera only he could see. Julian was 31, a vice president by way of his father's golf schedule, and he had a gift. Not for finance, for finding the softest place in a person and pressing his thumb into it in front of an audience. He'd been doing it to Mari for 4 years in increments small enough to deny the seat. He'd pull away and say, "Oh, this one's reinforced. You're welcome," the birthday cake. He'd slide toward her with "someone's got to." The way he said her name like it had a punchline in it. She wore emerald that night, her one good dress, 3 years old, taken in twice by her own hands at 2 in the morning. She had done her own hair. She had felt, walking in out of the rain, something dangerously close to fine. He found her by the bar at 9. He'd been drinking, but that was decoration. Julian didn't need alcohol to be cruel. He needed a crowd. He had one. Simone Kell from Investor Relations, sharp as folded paper, and 4 analysts who laughed on command, and 12 feet away and facing the other direction, 6 or 7 people who mattered. "Mary," he said, loud. "Mary, come here. Settle something." She should have walked. She had walked 1,000 times. She was so tired of walking. "We're doing seating for the Q1 dinner," Julian said, and he put his hand on her shoulder, which was the worst part, the ownership of it. "And I said we should just count you as 2. Not, no, don't make that face. It's logistics. It's math. Right? It's not personal. It's a load-bearing question." He turned to his audience, warming, finding the rhythm. "Honestly, at some point, HR has to admit the chairs are a safety issue. I've seen that woman eat lunch twice. In one lunch." Simone laughed. The analysts laughed. And Mari stood there in her emerald dress with the drink she couldn't feel in her hand and understood, with the awful clarity of a thing you've always known, that this was simply what her life was. That she would go home and she would iron this dress and she would come back at 6:40 tomorrow and nothing would ever change, because nothing had ever changed, because she had nothing, no money, no name, no power, nothing at all. Behind her, a glass touched a table. It wasn't loud. That was the thing she'd remember for the rest of her life. It wasn't loud. It was a small, precise, deliberate sound, crystal meeting marble, and the room turned toward it the way a field of grass turns before weather. Every conversation in the atrium stopped inside 2 seconds. Not politely, the way a heart stops. The man at table 1 stood up. He was enormous, and he moved like he had all night. Black suit, black tie, a face like something carved to survive winter, and eyes that had already finished the conversation before it started. He did not look angry. That was the horror of him. He looked interested, the way a man looks at a thing that has just made his day slightly more efficient. Across the atrium, Gareth Wexford put down his drink and quietly said, "Oh God." Cassian Belandi walked to the bar. He stopped 4 feet from Julian Ash. He looked at Mari first. 1 long, unhurried second, and something moved behind his face and was gone. And then he looked at Julian and asked, in a voice pitched so low that 200 people had to lean in to hear it, "Say it again, slower. I want to hear which words you chose." Julian smiled. He actually smiled. He didn't know yet. "I'm sorry, I don't think we've—" "You know who I am?" Not a question. Everyone in this room knows who I am, which is why nobody's laughing anymore. So, the words. He tilted his head. "You said load-bearing. You said safety issue. You put your hand on her. Which one do you want to start with?" The silence went on so long it became a physical object in the room. Somebody's phone buzzed and got smothered. "It was a joke," Julian said. His voice had gone up a register and he heard it and hated it and couldn't get it back down. "It was," Cassian agreed pleasantly. "I've been sitting there for 40 minutes listening to it. 4 years, apparently, if you ask the staff, which I did." He reached out. He took Julian's hand, the one that had been on her shoulder, and held it, not hard, the way you'd hold a document. Do you know what I actually do for a living, Mr. Ash? People think it's violence. It isn't. Violence is what happens when I've run out of better tools. What I do is I find out what a man is standing on, and then I decide whether he keeps standing on it. He let go of the hand. He straightened Julian's lapel with 2 fingers. You're standing on your father's name, $4 million of it, and a mortgage in Wellesley you took out in June. I know all 3. I've known for 6 weeks. He stepped back. Enjoy the party. I mean that. Have a wonderful night. Then he turned to Mari, and the whole room turned with him, and she felt 200 pairs of eyes land on her at once for the first time in 4 years. Ms. Vance, he said, your car's outside. I don't have a car. You do now. The car was a black Range Rover, and it smelled like leather and rain. He didn't speak for 6 blocks, neither did she. Her hands were shaking, and she wasn't sure it was fear. You said 4 years, she managed. You said you asked the staff. I asked everyone. I've been auditing Wexford Holdings since September. He was looking out the window at the wet city. Your name kept appearing. Not in the ledgers, in the margins. Requisitions denied. Access revoked. 3 separate people in that building have spent 4 years making very small decisions to keep you away from the archive floor. He turned. I wanted to know why a company would work that hard to keep a secretary away from paperwork. Mari's mouth went dry. Then you did, he said, and I found out. She said nothing. He waited. He was extraordinarily good at waiting. My father, she said. Thomas Vance, chief accountant. 6 years ago, he said the name carefully, the way you carry something breakable. He didn't take the 4 million. I know that. No, Cassian said. You believe that? There's a difference, and the difference is worth about $11,000 a month at Cedarbrook, isn't it? He watched her face change. I'm not threatening you, Ms. Vance. I'm telling you I have the file. Your father found something in the Harbor Line invoices that he wasn't supposed to be able to see. He wrote a memo. He sent it to one person he trusted. 10 days later, he was a thief. The rain ran down the glass in long gray fingers. Who? She said. That's the conversation. He turned fully toward her, and for one moment the stillness cracked, and she saw underneath it. Not rage, something older and colder and much more patient. 11 years ago, 4 men sat down with my father in a restaurant on Prince Street. 3 of them died. One of them walked out with a bullet in his shoulder and my father's blood on his shirt. And he has been at my right hand ever since, weeping about it every March. Cassian's voice did not change at all. I've spent 11 years being certain. Certainty isn't proof. Your father's memo is proof. It has been sitting in a Wexford Holdings archive box for 6 years because the man who framed him didn't dare destroy it. Destroying it would have proved it existed. Mari looked at this man, this rumor, this thing Boston whispered about, and understood the shape of what he was offering. You need me to get it. I need you to want to get it. I could take that building apart with money. I could take it apart with fear. But I'd be taking apart the wrong building, and he'd know I was coming an hour before I got there, because he always does. He looked at her hands. You've been sitting outside that floor for 4 years with no money, no leverage, and no chance. I have all 3. You have 4 years of noticing. Neither of us is enough alone. And what do you want out of it? Him, on his knees, in front of everyone who ever called him family. She should have said no. A good woman says no. What do I get? She asked. Something almost human passed across his face. Almost. Everything they took, Cassian Belandi said. And the pleasure of watching them notice. The remaking of Marisol Vance was not a fairy tale. She kept insisting on that, later, whenever anyone told it wrong. Nobody waved a wand. What happened was that a woman named Renata came to her apartment on a Tuesday with 3 racks of clothing and a tape measure, and the manner of a general, and said, "Stop apologizing for your ribcage. You have magnificent shoulders, and we are going to use them like a threat." What happened was 6 weeks of tailoring and a jewel-toned wardrobe cut to make her arrive in a room rather than enter it, and a woman in Cambridge teaching her to read a room's exits, and Cassian himself standing across the table at midnight running her through the Harbor Line's corporate structure until she could recite it backward. She did not get smaller. Not 1 inch. That was the entire point. She had spent 34 years being taught that her body was an apology her presence made in advance. Now she walked into the Wexford atrium in oxblood wool, with her chin up, and watched a room full of people who had never once looked at her turn their heads like flowers. And she felt it land. Not beauty. She'd never cared about beauty. Weight. Gravity. The understanding that she was the largest thing in the room, and had decided to stop pretending otherwise. Simone Kell stopped talking mid-sentence. Julian Ash left by the stairs. And the slow burn. God, the slow burn. It happened in the margins of the work, which is where the real things always happen. It happened at 2 in the morning over spreadsheets when she caught him rubbing his shoulder and said, "How long has that been broken?" And he said 11 years. And then, after a very long silence, he shot me too. I was in the kitchen. He told me to run and I ran, and I've been paying for it every day since. It happened when he taught her to shoot in a cold storage warehouse and stood behind her to correct her stance, and neither of them moved for 4 seconds too long. It happened when he took a call in front of her, said 9 words she didn't understand, hung up, and a man in Chelsea stopped existing. And he looked at her afterward with something like dread, waiting to see if she'd flinch. She didn't flinch. That should have frightened her more than it did. "You're not afraid of me," he said once, at 3 in the morning. And it wasn't a compliment. It was almost a complaint. "I'm terrified of you," Mari said. "I'm just not afraid for me. There's a difference." She looked at him across the table. "You're the only person in 6 years who read my father's name and didn't wince." The first strike was hers. Julian Ash's mortgage was leveraged against a note held by a shell company in Providence. Cassian bought the note in an afternoon. That was nothing. That was a phone call. What Mari did was better. She had spent 4 years processing Julian's expense reports, and she knew, because she had filed them, because nobody wonders what furniture notices, that between March and September he had approved 14 consulting payments to a firm that shared an address with his brother-in-law's boat storage. $800,000. Traceable. Stupid. So stupid, it was almost sweet. She didn't leak it. She did something crueler. She built the file, complete and beautiful, footnoted like her father would have footnoted it, and then she walked into Julian's office at 4 on a Friday and set it on his desk and sat down. "You're going to resign on Monday," she said, "and you're going to tell the board it was your idea. And then you're going to answer one question for me, honestly, and if it's honest, I'll keep this in a drawer." He read 4 pages. His hands were shaking so badly he tore the 5th. "What question?" he whispered. "6 years ago you were an analyst on the 12th floor. Somebody handed you a box of my father's files to shred." She leaned forward. "You didn't shred all of it, Julian. You're not brave, but you're not stupid either. You kept something back in case you ever needed it. Where is it?" He told her. She kept the file in a drawer. She was a woman of her word. She also made a copy. They came for her 9 days later. She was leaving Cedarbrook at 8 on a Thursday, still tasting the awfulness of an hour spent being called nurse by her own mother, and the van in the visitor's lot had been idling for 40 minutes. She knew because she'd noticed. She always noticed. 2 men. Not professionals. That was what saved her and what told her everything. Professionals would have taken her in the garage. These were errand boys, sent fast, sent angry, sent by somebody who had just learned that a box in an archive had been signed out and had lost his composure for the first time in 11 years. She had 11 seconds. She used 9 of them thinking. She walked toward them. That was the thing nobody expected. She walked toward the van, straight at it, and the driver's window came down out of pure confusion. And Mari Vance drove the heel of her hand into his throat and put the car keys through the back of the other man's hand as he reached for her. And then she was screaming loud. In the parking lot of a memory care facility with 40 windows facing it, screaming in a way she had not permitted herself in 6 years, lights came on, The van left. Cassian arrived in 11 minutes. She would think about that number later. 11 minutes across a city at rush hour was not driving. It was something else. He didn't say anything. He knelt down in the wet parking lot in a $4,000 suit and took her hands and turned them over and looked at the blood on them and asked, very quietly, "Is any of it yours?" No. Something went out of him. Something else came into him, and the parking lot got colder. "Stay in the car," he said. She didn't. She has never described what happened in the cold storage bay on Dry Dock Avenue that night, and she never will, except to say two things: that she watched a man she had kissed exactly 0 times take apart two people with a patience that had nothing to do with anger, and that when it was done he stood there breathing, and turned and saw her in the doorway seeing him. He looked for 1 second like a man reading his own sentence. "You should go," he said. Mari crossed the concrete. She took his ruined hand in both of hers. "I've had 4 years of men who smiled at me," she said. "I'd rather have this." He kissed her like a man going under. There was nothing sweet in it. It was possession and apology and 11 years of holding still, and he had her against the freight door, with one hand on her jaw and the other at her waist. And when he broke off, he was shaking and she wasn't. "Say it," she said. "You're mine," Cassian said hoarse, "and I will unmake this entire city before I let it touch you again." "Then let's start with the man who sent them." The box from Julian Ash's storage unit had 140 pages in it. 139 of them were nothing. The one that wasn't was a memo dated 6 years and 11 days ago on Wexford Holdings letterhead in her father's exact careful handwriting, addressed to the one man Thomas Vance had trusted with it. Because that man had come to their house at Christmas. Because that man had put $20 in Mari's hand at her high school graduation and called her Piccola. Because that man was Gareth Wexford's oldest friend and Cassian Belandi's underboss, and the person who had been embracing them both for 11 years. Vincent Salah. He had shot his own boss on Prince Street and put a bullet in a 24-year-old's shoulder, and then wept at the funeral and raised that boy into a king he could stand behind. He had used Wexford Holdings to wash Harborline money for a decade, and when a tired, gentle accountant found $4 million going out, a door that shouldn't exist, and wrote a memo to the man he trusted, Vincent Salah had read it and thanked him and framed him, and gone to his wake. Cassian read the page 3 times. Then he set it down and stood at the window for a long while, and Mari watched 11 years leave a man's body. "He held my hand," Cassian said, "at the hospital. I know. He picked my father's casket." "I know," Mari said. "Now sit down. We're not going to shoot him." He turned. "Aren't we?" "No." She spread the file across the table, her father's file, footnoted, beautiful. "Shooting him makes him a legend. Your people will tell stories about him for 30 years. I want something better." She looked up, and her voice was very calm, and Cassian Belandi would say later that this was the exact moment he knew he'd already lost every argument they would ever have. "I want him to be small." They did it at the Harborline's Christmas dinner. 200 people. Vincent at the head table, red-faced and laughing, telling a story about Cassian's father he had told 400 times. Mari walked in green. She let them look. She let 200 people who had spent a lifetime deciding what a woman like her was for turn and stare, and she crossed that whole long room at her own unhurried pace. And she sat down in the empty chair beside Vincent Salah and put a manila envelope on the tablecloth between the bread and the wine. "Mr. Salah," she said, "my name is Marisol Vance." She watched it hit him. She had waited 6 years to watch that. It was worth every day. "Thomas Vance's daughter," she said. "You were at his funeral. You told me he was a good man who made a mistake, and you squeezed my shoulder when you said it." The table had gone quiet. The quiet was spreading outward like something spilled. "Open the envelope," Mari said. He didn't, so she did. She read the memo aloud. She read it in a clear voice to 200 people in a rented ballroom in Southie. Her father's careful sentences, his footnotes, his terrible politeness. I'm sure there's an explanation, and I'd hate to raise this improperly. And she watched Vincent Sala's face come apart, one muscle at a time, and behind her standing silent, Cassian let his people watch their underboss learn what he was. Vincent went for the inside of his jacket. Nobody moved to help him. Not one man at that table, not one man in that room. That was the whole reckoning right there. Not violence, arithmetic. 200 people all doing the same math at the same instant and arriving at the same answer. They're not going to, Mari told him gently. They've been counting since page 1. He was crying. He was 71 years old and crying at a Christmas dinner. Cassian, he said. Cassian Figlio, please. Don't. Cassian said, use that word. The federal indictment came in March, 11 counts, on the ledgers Vincent himself had built, delivered by a route Mari had spent 2 months laying and never once told him about. Gareth Wexford went with him. 6 years for obstruction, and every single obituary of his career led with the accountant he'd let take the fall. Julian Ash's resignation held until April, when someone anonymous sent $800,000 of boat storage invoices to the SEC. And after that, Julian Ash was a man who returned other men's calls, and on a wet loading dock in South Boston 11 months after a party he did get on his knees. And he did cry into a phone that no longer dialed out, and the woman standing over him under a black umbrella looked at him for a long, quiet moment and decided he wasn't worth the shoes. She left him there. That was the mercy. It was the last one he ever got from anybody. They cleared Thomas Vance's name in a 2-inch column on page 11 of the Globe. Mari framed it anyway. It hangs in the hall of a house on the water where her mother lives, now in the good wing with a garden, and some mornings she knows Mari's name and some mornings she doesn't. And every single morning the bill is paid. Marisol Vance does not work at Wexford Holdings. There is no Wexford Holdings. There is a shipping consortium on 12 miles of Boston waterfront, and on the top floor there is an office with 2 chairs at one desk, and the woman in the larger chair reads every invoice that crosses it, because her father taught her that the truth is almost always in the footnotes. They married in October. She wore red. Cassian Belandi, who has never in his life raised his voice, stood in front of 400 people who had once laughed at a joke about chairs and said 11 words, "This is my wife." Consider very carefully what that means. Nobody has needed a second explanation. They spent 4 years deciding she was furniture, and it cost them a company, a syndicate, and every single thing they'd ever built, because the terrible risk you run in making a woman invisible is that she gets to watch you. Being underestimated isn't a wound. It's a position. Hold it long enough, and one day you get to choose the hour. Don't ever let anyone make you smaller than you are. Some of them are counting on it. If Mari's reckoning was worth your time tonight, hit that like button. Send this to someone who loves a heroine with teeth. Subscribe for a new story every week, and tell me down in the comments when she read that memo out loud at the table. Does she go far enough, or would you have gone further?